Welcome. We're just going to wait a few seconds here because we know it can take some time for people to come into the room, and we can see the numbers like leaping up, which is very exciting. But if you're looking for the DPI launch map, just want to reassure you, you're in the right place. That's if you're not, um, surprise, but you're welcome to stay. We'd love for you to learn about the DPI map. Just going to wait a little bit longer. That number of participants is still climbing up pretty steadily. So I'm just going to allow people to come into the room. We're still climbing here a little bit, but I think we'll get started in 30 seconds. One thing, just to note that there is a question button that we have at the bottom of the screen on like your thing, just kind of at the bottom there. If you have questions, feel free to post them there. Chat is not enabled just because of the sheer number of people. We're currently sitting at 132, and it's kind of hard to manage chat often with that many people. So if you do have questions for us, post them there. This launch event will be a kind of general launch event. Someone else already asked a question if it's going to be tailored towards health or education. This digital public infrastructure map is actually our general launch event that's really focused again on the kind of what we discovered around digital identities, payment systems, and data exchanges. And we'll just kind of be covering what we've done, what we've accomplished, and some of the early insights we've had. Okay, I think we've now waited long enough to gather people. So maybe I'll just start off by doing a round of introductions. I'm going to allow the three of us to introduce ourselves. So my name's David Eves. I'm an associate professor of digital government here at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and I'm the PI on this project of the digital public infrastructure map. Christina, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina. I lead the DPI mapping project as manager. I'm also a research fellow at IIPP, UCL, and hopefully you've heard of me and heard me ask you for a lot of data for the map. Hopefully that continues.
Thank you, Christina. And Julia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, my name is Julia. I'm a policy fellow at IIPP as well. And in this project, I was a researcher focused mainly in digital identities.
Perfect, thank you. Christina, if you take us to the next slide. As some of you know, we've been working on this project for over a year now, and this is kind of the launch event for what we're calling version 2 of the DPI map, where we now have more data to share and some newer insights, and some other learnings that we're going to be kind of sharing with you all. I'm very excited to get there, but before we do that, there's a few just housekeeping things that are so important to get done. So the first thing, if we go to the next slide, is the work over the last year to make this happen has been very, very significant. And it is so important just to acknowledge like the incredible like hard work that particularly these individuals have done. So Julia, who's on the call, and Christina, who you're seeing, there is a third member of this team, Kasim, who couldn't join us live. But I cannot talk to you about the number of hours that they have put in, chasing down, tracking down, trying to find data to make this map complete. And so I want to acknowledge their hard work. There are also some people who've been really instrumental who are not kind of listed here, but people like Jordan Sandman, who's based out of Co-Develop, who's also been very, very helpful. And we had some previous research fellows with us who helped kind of in the early stages of this project make this happen as well. So this is the internal team that's making this happen here at the IPP, and I'm just so grateful for all the hard work that they've done to make this resource possible. We can go to the next slide. This work, though, is not just the work of the IIPP. There's been an ecosystem of people who have been very, very helpful. And this page here lists organizations from which people have emerged who have offered us help by pointing us in directions where there's data, finding kind of like errors and helping us like, zero in and getting more accurate the data we have. I think what I want to be clear about on this screen is these organizations don't necessarily like endorse the results of our map, but they have been so helpful. And the people in these organizations have been so helpful in making the map a success. that we really just wanted to acknowledge them. And I think of people like I mentioned last time, like the team at Africa Ninda, who spent like several hours on Zoom with us, walking us through their data so we could help integrate it in the work that we've done. And so every one of these organizations, if you don't know them, please take a screenshot of this, and they're worth it's worth kind of going and looking at what they do in this space and more generally, because they're great people doing great work in all of them. I think at this time, I'd also just like to thank Co-Develop, who has been a primary sponsor of this work and helped making it happen, and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who have also been kind of supportive of this work. Okay, let's go to this next slide. Okay, this time we have some interactive things we'd like to be doing with you all. So if you have a cell phone, if you could pull it out and take use this QR code or use that link, go over to a Slido. We have a series of questions that we'd like to ask you just to test your DPI knowledge and see what you know. So I'm going to leave this up for a few seconds, make sure that you're at the right place. If you're not, I see one person said they're not able to see the screen. It's the only person who's saying that. So I think most people can see the screen, but if you cannot, pose a question just saying you still can't see our screen, but hopefully you're seeing that QR code. Okay, you may have already been prompted with our first question, which is, let's go to that next slide. Of the 210 countries that we surveilled, how many do you think have a DPI-like identity system? Just going to let people give them a little chance to vote here. A few more seconds. Don't be fooled by the green. I got fooled before. Green is not the right answer. It's just the current majority answer. So I don't want you to, if you're voting green because you think that's the right answer, you're actually just following the herd. You may not actually be getting to the actual truth. Okay, interesting. Christina, do you want to reveal to us? Oh, it's a horse race going on right now.
Yeah, I was going to come in, but we're going to leave.
Yeah, I know. I was like, what is the wisdom of the crowd tell us? Okay, let's call it now.
Well, it's closer to 27%, which represents 57 identity systems.
That's right.
But that's based on some assumptions and hypotheses, which we'll get to in a bit.
Which we will get to. You'll notice we call it DPI-like identity systems. And this is because, again, with our data, we're trying hard not to say what is actually DPI. We're trying to chart what the attributes are and map what's against those attributes. And so for this one, we'll talk a little bit about how we arrived at the number of 27%. Okay, this is great. So one thing I like about this is that even among DPI experts, there's lack of clarity about kind of what the answer would be. Like this is a group of people who would have more idea than almost anybody else on the planet about what the right answer would be, but actually we have a real diversity here too. Okay, let's go to our next question, which is of the 210 countries, how many have DPI-like payment systems?
I think the poll is rigged now because they know where to go and look for the answers.
Do you think some people are doing their research? Okay, our poll started to stabilize. Here, I think our number starts to get a little more green. Green really is green.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's correct. Here we're as 44% of countries do have a DPI-like payment system. And again, towards the end of this presentation, Christina is going to walk you through the methodology we use to get to that. Okay, let's do one last final question for the third type here. How many do you think have data exchange systems or DPI-like data exchange systems. Just going to assume those were 2 votes that happened right away. They both shot up to 50-50 right away as a real. Again, though, I think it's so interesting how little we know, even like this group of experts, and the diversity of responses to this question.
I think this time we've successfully managed to sway you to think in a certain way, because the right answer is not the most voted for.
No, it's not the most voted. It says this answer is actually one of the more surprising conclusions of our research. There's a lot more data exchange happening out there in the world than people realized. So we'll reveal that in a couple of seconds. Let's go to the next slide. So just want to remind you, everybody, our map. So this is the version 2 of our map. It's now live. That QR code will take you to the map, and there's the link to the DPI map that you can go to. Let me just step back and just talk a little bit about the history map and share some high-level results and some of the things that I think are going to be important. So let's go to the next slide. Here where we are on our journey. So back in October of 2023, we did some preliminary desk research and developed a framework for thinking about how we might measure the DPI around the world. And so that involved going out, reading everything we could find about everybody who'd written about DPI, how they were defining it, how they were thinking about it. That allowed us to come up with kind of a framework that was kind of like started down the path of what our attributes are that you now see in the map. Then in April, we ran some expert consultations. We ran at least one consultation on each of identity, payment systems, and data exchanges. We did do a little bit more than that. And there we gathered people who were in the donor community, people who were actually building these systems, government officials who had implemented them, people in the kind of advocacy space who were thinking about privacy or other types of issues, and gathered their feedback about our attributes, and then used those to iterate and learn and adjust the attributes that we wanted to go measure. We then use that to kind of refine some of the research we'd already been doing and then do further research. And so back in June, many of you were with us when we launched the first version of our map, which was only with 132 countries that were predominantly in the global south. So mostly LATAM, Africa, and some of Asia. And that was both an opportunity for us to test how were we able to gather this data well, and then were these attributes actually being effective? And so it was kind of like, let's do an alpha version. And that proved to be helpful in that our attributes were deemed to be useful by people. They were it's not easy, but we are able to go track down data about them. And so it validated those hypotheses. So we've spent the last several months basically taking that version 1 to scale to try to tackle all 210 countries. And so that's what we're launching today. So when you go to our website, it'll broadly look the same, but when you actually go look at the map data, you're no longer looking at just 132 countries, you're looking at 210 countries. 2 other things I want to add to this. No, just go back. Let's just go back yet. The other thing I just want to say is, one thing that I kind of noted when we gathered everybody for the first launch is that we were kind of lying and that we didn't have a map. Really, we just had a spreadsheet of data. And I really want to thank the team at Place, which is an amazing kind of nonprofit entity that helps countries collect mapping data. And they ribbed us a little for not actually having a map. And we kind of said, yeah, we don't have that in-house expertise. And they have actually helped build a map for us. And so now when you go to our website, there is an actual visualization. And so what's nice for this is for some policymakers and for some individuals, getting the whole spreadsheet is like not what they're looking for. They kind of want to go in and just like click on a country and take a look. I think for people who are doing really deep research, having that spreadsheet is super helpful, but having the visualization is nice. And so I just want to thank the team at Place, a great organization, who really stepped up and helped make that happen for us. Okay, let's go to the next one, and then I'll share my caveats for you. Here are the numbers that we had. And so you can see on the data exchange where like it's kind of 50, it's like, and that 50% choice was the right choice. It's like really a lot more data exchanges going on in the world. But these are our new high level numbers. And there's a few things I want to say about these. One is the numbers are interesting in that there's a lot more DPI going on in the world than I think people realized. These are numbers that Christy is going to talk about that are based on some attributes that we basically think are kind of minimally required in order to think about being DPI, but we hold that definition very loosely and we encourage you to draw your own conclusions. And so you may look at our data and be like, actually, David, I don't agree with you and Christina and Julia about these being the numbers. I think they're much higher or they're much lower because you are going to choose different attributes by which to make your definition. And we would love nothing more than for people to do that and to make their own cases about what they think the numbers are that are out there. So the second thing I'd say is we reserve the right for these numbers to go up and down. I'd like to try to tell everybody we have this we exist in this koan-like space of kind of like zenness where we're very proud of the work we've done. And we do think that we have one of the most complete data set on the planet for DPI. And we're very proud of that data set. And at the same time, we know that data is not perfect. We are relying a lot on desk research. And so there are possibilities that things have not happened that governments have claimed have happened, or things have happened that actually are not visible and are hard to track down. This is particularly true for data exchange. And so we would love nothing more than for people to tell us where we've gotten wrong and where we could be improving because they see something that we missed. And so these numbers may fluctuate over the next few months, but I do think as a broad generalization, these numbers are generally accurate, even if they're not 100% perfectly accurate, and they may change a little bit over time. But again, a lot more going on. I think one of the things that this tells us is there's a lot more research opportunities that exist to go drill in on some of the DPIs that exist around the world and to learn more about, are there more hidden success cases out there that don't have champions that say PICS or the Estonians have to really kind of tell the world about their case, and there's some quiet successes out there. It also suggests that there's a fair bit of DPI that maybe is not fulfilling its potential, and we have research and work to do to figure out why that is the case. And maybe it's meeting a government's policy objective, but is not actually meeting the kind of broader infrastructure potential. Why is it the case? Is that by design? Is that on purpose? Or is that a failure on some part? And can we learn lessons from that to help others be more successful? So I think there's both good news and cautionary news in these numbers. Okay, let's go to the next slide and just talk briefly a little bit about what we've learned. So one thing that we've learned is that we have a genuine audience, and the fact that there are over 200 people on this launch event call tells us that there's genuine interest out there. We have been delighted by the fact that so many people, so we've had at least 21 organizations reach out to us, sometimes just to tell us, oh, this has become critical to operations. We're using this to kind of tell people in our organization what's going on, to help them target with partners. So sometimes those are funders, sometimes those are government organizations. That's been very validating. Even better has been when they've shown up and say, we love this tool, we're using it, and we think we found something that you could, we think we found a data set that is wrong on your data here. And we just want to, again, reiterate how grateful we are for everybody who shows up and says that. So those 21 has actually grown even since we created these slides. We continue to get more feedback from people, and they're helping us both with data accuracy, finding new DPI deployments, helping us think about our metrics and how we measure and what the data sources we are. And so that could be you. And so we'd love to talk to you if that's the case. We do feel like we had a bunch of hypotheses about the kind of types of metrics that we're using to measure DPI and some of the speculation about how much DPI is out there. And what's been really delightful about this project is those hypotheses have broadly been confirmed in our mind. And so we're very open to pushback, but we feel like these broadly have been, and we're currently both working on an academic paper to quantify and explain how we arrived at the indicators we arrived at, and then another one to talk a little bit about some of the preliminary results that we've had that Christina is going to dive into more detail on. So with that, let me hand things over to Christina.
Thank you, David. Okay, we have about 200 people in the room. Hopefully, I can hold on to your attention for the next 15 or so minutes, and then we open up the platform for questions from you. So the DPI Map Toolkit, if you've gone to the website and logged on to dpimap.org, hopefully you notice that it's an expansive set of tools that's meant for a wide range of stakeholders and users. This project has been a year in the making, but across the year, we've consulted with users of different kinds. The primary users are listed here. Center stage is, of course, the government. We want this to be a tool that folks within the government or those working alongside governments, like researchers, builders, advocates, can help point to how are other countries doing this, or what is a regional baseline of the state of DPI with respect to a certain component, like digital IDs or digital payments, or even data exchanges. This hopefully allows a more 30,000 feet view, which is a high level data point on the state of things, so that North Star is forming in a more realistic way, instead of just pointing to the 5 case studies in DPI that typically are referred to in the DPI space, but may not be very contextually relevant to a lot of these governments in many cases. These are users that have been important to not only building the DPI map to this stage, but they're also users that we envision engaging with very highly over the next months and year to see how the map and its tools, which are currently open access and completely meant for use for anyone, including the framework, how we developed it, and the data set. But we want to make these tools more directly and easily accessible to these set of users. So if you're in this room and you haven't engaged with us yet on how the map could be better or could better suit your needs, please do so. This is a very welcome invitation to do that. We wanted to talk a little bit about the framework. So as this started the exercise of mapping, we obviously had to go back to the drawing board and read a lot of literature on just the things said about DPI. The definition still tends to be elusive, even though David and our colleague Jordan from CoDevelop have written a definitional document. We don't want to treat that as the only conceptualization of DPI out there. We've referred to about 20 sources of what a DPI definition should look like. And I've tried to articulate in an inductive way what that tells us about the attributes of DPI, which are the characteristics of DPI. We've come up with about 6, and the 4 pillars you see here, and if you can't read them directly because the font might be small, let me read them out. So what's important is interoperability and extensibility, transparency, accountability, and oversight, privacy, protection, and safety, and inclusion and non-discrimination. On first view, you can see that this directly speaks to not only the technology aspects of DPI, but also the government aspect. What we additionally found out is that in order for DPI to be successful in a context, it needs to speak to the internal public sector capacity and how different units within the public sector coordinate with each other to realize the infrastructure value of DPI. And then, of course, the arrows that you see moving upwards points to the fact that the scale of adoption, which means that DPI is not DPI unless it's used by not only the government and its units, but also the rest of society, including the private sector, civil society, so on and so forth. On the right, you see a glimpse of what our deductive portion of research has been. So once we conceptualized the 6 attributes, we went into identifying a list of metrics and indicators. This was done in order to identify norms, rules, technologies, processes, to come up with a list of ways in which the attributes on the left could be realized. And these could be variable across identity, payments, and exchanges, but we also found a lot of them to be similar. A quick note to make here is that while we found an extensive set of indicators, which are, I think, nearing 70 across IDs, payments, and exchanges, we realized that not all of them might be measurable. So we want to make it very clear that while we know that there is a North Star in terms of measurement and indicator, the DPI map doesn't do the exhaustive job of mapping everything. Based on our methodology of data collection, we arrived at about 20% of these indicators that we set out to measure, given that our methodology is desk-based and relies on publicly reported data sources. And those are what are measured. There are still a lot of indicators out there that we want to know about DPI in order to know how well it's doing or if it even exists. But these are shared with you so that hopefully and potentially you have either data to contribute to the map, which are not publicly reported and might be internal, or these are of interest, research interest to you, and you want to take it further in terms of investigation yourselves. This is all accessible on the methodology web page of the DPI mapping website, but you will also see QR codes through this website that direct you directly to the tool within the larger map that I'm talking about. So important caveats before I go into the next leg of this, which is that our data collection methodology for the map, while it's based on the framework that I just spoke about, it collects a limited set of, it collects data against a limited set of indicators, and this data has to be reported publicly, typically by government or by credible intermediaries or by implementers who work alongside government and with government. We've scanned what seems credible and what doesn't seem credible, and a lot of that will be shared in the academic paper that David alluded to at the beginning of the session. The scope of DPI is limited to identity, payments, and exchanges, and this is not to say that our ground truth of what DPI is going to be limited to this forever. This is based on constant evolution, and as the consensus grows around what is DPI evolves, so will the map and what it measures and tracks. For now, this is digital identity, digital payments, and data exchange. The reliability and validity of the measurement and data collection methodology is based on peer reviews. It's based on a lot of expert interviews, not only across IDs, payments, and exchanges as subject matter areas, but also within regions. So we didn't want to use, say, a benchmark that is true for studying interoperability in digital payment systems in Europe and compare that with how things are happening in Oceania. We needed to come up with a standardized sort of indicator that could make space for what is baseline across regions and across different components. So we've consulted with not only regional experts, but also component-specific experts and tried to bring in their point of view within not only the framework, but also the data collection methodology as far as possible. That being said, our team operates with very limited resources. Who you see on screen right now is 75% of the entire team. So if you have ideas on how the data collection methodology could be improved and maybe want to suggest a data source that may be overlooked or a way of measuring a certain indicator that we've overlooked, please reach out to us. We're very interested in hearing. Finally, and hopefully the most exciting part of this project has been the myth busting, but also very honestly, a lot of the summaries shared and the opinions shared about DPI and the state of DPI so far have been speculative because there hasn't been data. So a lot of these things we've known for a while, but they've been hypotheses that have not been tested. We managed to get some, if not all data, to move in a direction of evidence-based inferences. And a few of these inferences have been shared. We've written blogs about this. You can check it out on our website. But we wanted to highlight some of these that have been very instrumental in how our team and we believe the ecosystem is gathering around thinking about DPI. So the first one is that the clear definition of DPI remains very important to how it's measured and how its potential can be unlocked. What do we mean by this? An example comes from how we study digital identity systems. So this is what we like to refer to as a funnel of conceptualizing digital identity systems as DPI. You see that we started with a broad sample of 210 countries. A lot of the data within the 210 countries was not accessible to us. We've left them as unknown. If you're looking at the spreadsheets or the map, you'll see a lot of unknown data points. This is that blue chunk of known unknowns. Hopefully, the map grows and we have more data about these countries. But we did know about a fair number of these countries, and out of them, 164 claim to have a digital or electronic ID. And this is very meaningful because it means that countries are steadily working towards a digital ID program, and they're treating that as an infrastructure component of their broader tech and software stack. It was very important to us that these IDs are actually functional and they're active. So we segmented further for those that were in the rollout stage. And Julia, David, and I, Julia especially, has been thinking a lot about how much of what countries say exists can actually be taken for does it truly exist. So we've tried to establish what those sort of cutoff criteria are, and you can read a lot about how we used here a seemingly simplified indicator to study the data and investigate, is it a yes or a no for a certain indicator. All of this is available in our code book, which you can find on the methodology page. Further to that, very important to ID systems, we've considered whether they have a digital authentication mechanism, which is there a way to use this ID system to figure out, is Julia really Julia, and does she deserve this dole out, or is she eligible for the dole out, or some sort of other KYC detailing that a digital ID or a credential like this might be used for. And then finally, because we're very concerned with cross-sectoral adoption to really be able to realize the infrastructure function of this digital ID, we segmented for whether ID systems were used and accessible across at least 2 sectors, which is we looked for evidence for the same ID system to be used as a system for authentication or as a credential for more than one sector, and that could be any. And obviously, this is minimum possible benchmarks. It's not to say that these indicators frame what DPI is and what DPI should be as a static concept here on out. But this represented a balance between what we valued as characteristics and attributes in DPI with what was possible to read from real world country level data. We did a similar exercise for payment systems and data exchanges as well. And I just wanted to highlight what was important as criteria to us, but you'll see the filtering function being very useful. It's very easy to use our raw data to use columns as filter functions. We plan on doing more webinars on how to do this, but that's the exercise we did to arrive at this funnel function. And hopefully you find value in maybe weighting a certain indicator differently from us and creating a similar funnel for your own purposes. For us, with respect to payment systems, the indicator of whether or not the payment systems, since very often they tend to be privately owned and operated, for us, it was of great importance for it to be DPI to have some sort of public interest governance involved. For payment systems, this meant that they were operated by the central bank, not only governed, because it's fair, every private payment system almost was regulated and governed by a central bank or a financial system regulator. But we looked for those that were operated by a central bank, and we found about 93. And then when further filtering for whether they operated as infrastructure across domains, we only arrived at 18 payment systems. Domains, a note here, means whether you can conduct transactions across different channels. So if you're a mobile wallet, you can also transact with bank accounts. And if you're a bank account, you can also transact with private mobile. Similarly, with data exchanges, when we did this exercise, a unique indicator that stood out is whether or not data exchanges disclosed information about their technical architecture and enrollment conditions. This we considered crucial because a lot of data exchanges seem to exist in silos simply because agencies within the same government didn't know how to interact with the system. If enrollment conditions and participation conditions and details on how to integrate with a prevalent data exchange were widely shared and were transparently accessible, they tended to be having more cross-sectoral functions. Finally, we were curious about how DPI performed across income levels. There tends to be this idea that more mature economies would have more sophisticated DPI, even though they might not be calling it DPI. Is it true that they naturally have more sophisticated ecosystems? And we found really compelling narratives. An example of this is with respect to digital payment systems. What was really interesting here is when we looked for whether payment systems that we treated as DPI for this exercise, if we looked at the ones that functioned only at the bank level, that is, banks can transact with each other, versus at the cross-domain level, that is, banks can transact with mobile wallets and mobile wallets with banks, hence cross-domain. We found real differences across countries with different income levels. What is really interesting to see here is that within middle-income countries, there was a high proportion of cross-domain payment systems that could be treated as DPI, which was more than the proportion prevalent in high-income countries. And this shifted further when we filtered for those payment systems that had public interest operation structures. So here, the proxy we used is the payment system operated by the central bank? And when we further filtered for that, the number of cross-domain payment systems definitely reduced. Overall, the number of payment systems counted as DPI reduced. But we saw that drastically change in high-income countries and completely disappear for countries that were low income, categorized as low income. A very important pattern also emerged with respect to regional differences. And this is, there's been speculation about this. We just didn't have the data to marry how exactly does it look different. We tried to investigate this with respect to data exchange systems. And this has been a real eye-opener. So when thinking about data exchanges as DPI, the prevalent conception is that it's not a data exchange system if it's not as sophisticated as X-Road, which is that it should facilitate real-time data exchange, all of the information around eligibility conditions as well as technical architecture should be shared in a descriptive way, in a very accessible way. But when we looked for criteria like, does the data exchange happen in real time? Is it housed by and facilitated by a government agency, and one or two other criteria, we found that there's, in fact, a lot of models other than X-Roads that could facilitate this. And they might not be as sophisticated and have the same security server architecture that the X-Road does and allows a certain degree of integrity and resilience with data exchanges. And the governance conversation can be had about what other features with governance need to be an inherent part of DPI, but the models of how this data exchange happened were incredibly diverse. So we found a few models. We found API gateways, we found UXPs, enterprise service buses, and a few other models which we couldn't conceptualize or categorize in these categories. We've called them other, but there are diverse models out there. And the distribution of how these fare across regions of the world tells a story. For example, and this is counting the countries for which we had the data, obviously. So you'll see Caribbean saying all of Caribbean has only X-Road. It doesn't mean that each of the countries in the Caribbean has X-Road. It means for the countries that we had data about, we only found data on X-Road. But we see regional diversity in the sense that with Africa and North America, there's almost a similar distribution of API gateways, which is considered not a very sophisticated version of data exchange. It was similarly distributed across Africa and North America. But X-Road was way more prevalent in Africa than in North America. Obviously, the sample size is small, but proportion-wise, it was way more prevalent in Africa. We also see that UXP and not only X-Road was prevalent in Europe, which is not surprising, but there's also more models that we haven't been able to categorize prevalent in Europe. So data exchange across the board has been the most challenging to study because as middleware, there's not a lot of data published on what a country's data exchange system looks like. It's almost hidden behind an MIS, which is only accessible by government agency participants or users. So if you're in this room and you have a way to get around this and tell us more about data exchanges, this graph might change completely over the next while, but we're really, really interested in learning more about it. And with that, I can come to our final ask. This project has been a year in the making, but the next year of its value is only going to depend on how much the data is going to be useful to users in this room and outside of it. So this is an invitation to hopefully help us make the DPI map a live tool, a usable tool, and more accessible to your needs. There's different ways to do this. The easiest way is to book a meeting if you have data to contribute, or use a feedback form, which is a 30-second feedback form, wherein we ask you to look at the map, potentially a country, maybe a region, find what's wrong, almost like a bug spotting system, and take 30 seconds to fill out a very simple Google form, after which we reach out to you and ask you for more information in order to validate the data you provide and reflect it on the map. We also have a newsletter. A lot of this data is going to be dynamically changing over the next while, and the insights we draw from it are going to evolve. We also plan on releasing a number of user-specific resources in the form of webinars such as these for researchers or government partners or capacity building units. If you're interested in accessing any of those resources, a good way to do that is to sign up for the newsletter and stay in touch with us and the team. What's coming up over the next while is a methodology white paper that David referred to. If you have questions about how we came to certain conclusions on identifying an indicator and then coming up with a metric based on that indicator, this is the paper you should be reading, and you can expect that to be released in a white paper format because it wouldn't have been academically peer reviewed then in about a month. And of course, a state of DPI report, where hopefully we have a better scan of the state of data over the next while, and we can inform the ecosystem in a more methodological way. And you can expect that early next. And with that, I think I'll pause. We'll open the platform up to questions now. If you haven't already put them in the chat box, you should do so now, but Julia will help us categorize and figure out what can be grouped and answered together. Thank you.
I have actually been answering some of the questions live in type. So just so people know, in the Q&A, there's like open questions and then there's answered questions. And some of the answered questions I've typed into. But Julia, I'll hand the floor to you to pick a question for us to tackle.
Yes. Let's start. I'll start with a question brought by Maria Luciano. I know she's from IDEC. And let me just share the answer live, but I will also read it out loud so you can get it. So she asks about the public resources, which are scarce in some places if we think only of official ones. It reminded me of the work we did in the Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker. Is adding ethnographic data on the horizon for this project? I think this is an interesting question because it talks about how live the database we developed can be throughout the time.
Maybe just to take a first crack at this. So one of the reasons, so I think we have like 7 places on our website for a call to action where we ask people to send us information. And I think we are actually, like we are definitely interested in non-government source data, because again, sometimes the government source data is inaccurate. So I think in some ways we're already doing this. So if someone approaches us and says, hey, actually, there was an announcement, maybe there was even a loan to deploy a data exchange, but actually it's still not gone live, but we've through sources believe that it is live because there's maybe been a public announcement where government says we're doing it. We can then interrogate and work with that contributor to figure out, okay, what's really happening in this context. And so I think we're very, very open to that feedback. We are trying to be quite rigorous about our methodology. So it's not just like anybody who sends us information and says, oh, this isn't true or this is true, we just blindly accept that. We will take that ethnographic information into our methodology, and it will cause us to probe more kind of deeply. But Christina, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think that's more or less true. We do have a validation mechanism to make sure that the data we receive is treated in the very same way the data for other countries has been treated. So if it doesn't provide sufficient evidence for having achieved a certain indicator, we probably won't reflect it and keep that conversation alive. So we'll give you feedback on why we think there are certain gaps, and hopefully we can work together to address those gaps.
One thing I'd say too is those types of responses are also helpful for us because and it's doubly helpful if you know who the government officials are that we could talk to, because we are very happy to go actually talk directly with government officials. But sometimes it's hard to know who they are and who to reach out to them. So if someone calls us and says, actually, I think this is inaccurate, we will do our own investigation. But if they also have contacts with government officials that we could reach out to, so we could engage with them, so that then we could get the evidence that we need to kind of meet the test that Christina is talking about, we're very, very keen to have that.
We also received a lot of questions around data exchange, so I'll try to group them all in a single question for you guys to answer. So I think one broad question is if you could elaborate what do we mean by data exchange? Are we referring to a marketplace with catalogs of APIs or a more tech platform that automates data sharing? And then building upon that, people also asked if the data exchange platform data include any open data portal that is built on manual processes of sharing data. And there were also some questions asking about sectoral data exchange, mainly for health data, which is something that always comes up when we're discussing this topic. So I think it would be interesting if we also touch upon why we didn't look at sectoral data exchange systems.
Christina, why don't you go first on this one, and then I'll come in.
Yes, I wanted to quickly share my screen to also give you a live view of how we would treat the question. The framework that we've been referring to, the methodology framework that has been the basis of the map, took up this entire exercise. What do we value in a data exchange for it to be treated as a DPI? And how do we articulate which of those is important? So you see here the data exchange framework, which is on the methodology page of the mapping website. You'll see the attributes that were 6 referred to on the left. You'll also see an order, which is our very loose way of saying there are some attributes, some indicators that are of inherent value to a DPI, and some of these may be more aspirational for all DPI across the world to achieve. So we categorize them as must-haves and good-to-haves. And then we come up with a list of ways to achieve interoperability and extensibility or transparency, accountability, and oversight. So there are about 15 or 20 criteria that a data exchange system has to achieve in order to be treated as DPI, or for it to be even listed on the map, because one is a segment of the other. And to your question of do platforms where, say, data is uploaded, like an open data platform, would that as a model be treated as a data exchange system? Most likely not, and it's definitely not included in the map. And that's because it's not individual level data that's exchanged in real time by governments in order to provide a service. It can be downloaded as a data set, which is non-personal, which is useful for evidence-based policymaking, but the use case for it to be used as DPI, which is more individual level service delivery, is not met.
I think we also have 2 interesting questions about regional DPIs. So the first one is, do you map DPI at the regional level or only at the national level? And Gabrielle, who shared this question, said, I'm thinking about EU digital identity, eIDAS, and data exchange initiatives. And also something that is somehow related to this is another question that is, now that you have this global picture, do you have any high-level takeaways on the politics of the countries investing in different forms of DPI and whether they approach them from different starting points or with different aims? So I think it's interesting to talk about this regional perspective, which appeared in some of the DPI deployments we investigated. and also about how investing relates to this.
Christina, why don't you go first too? I was
Yeah.
typing something.
Yeah, and Julia, maybe you want to come in with eIDAS also. Julia is the one who dealt with the identity system portion of the DPI map, so she's very qualified to answer that very specifically. But to the question of did we deal with regional deployments at all? Yes, we did, but you might not see it reflected in the visual map. You'll see it reflected on the data set only because it's difficult to also visualize regional overlaps with country level systems. The one interesting insight is, especially with payment systems, I know this to be true, is that very often if the regional payment system is adopted enough and has enough political buy-in, then it might replace a national payment system that would operate as DPI. So because setting up a payment switch and operating it is fairly resource intensive and needs capacity, a country might rely on a regional switch to conduct transactions in real time. So very often that happened. You can see it reflected in the data set, and I can drop a link to the raw data set on this chat.
Yeah. And just building on the eIDAS discussion, I think our rationale for this specifically was to consider this sort of regulation as the overarching policy that would guide digital identities implementation in Europe, of course, and to make sure that you can always compare the indicators with the policy that we used as our basis for analysis. In the spreadsheet, you were going to find exactly which indicators we mapped with eIDAS and which indicators we mapped with more specific data from each country and more contextual data from each country. So I think this is a helpful way to try to interpret this data from eIDAS, from Europe particularly. But let me get some questions here. We have been receiving some questions regarding sovereignty and also privacy issues. So I'll pick one, which I think summarizes somehow all of them. So picking up on the comment around the ownership and DPI in the public interest, who owns DPI and how do we guard against over-reliance on private sector capability, vendor lock-in, and excessive rent? And although we know this was not entirely the focus of our investigation, I think it's always interesting to touch upon this and maybe mention also other governance initiatives we've been working on.
Yeah, Julia, maybe I'll just dive in here. One thing, if you could do, I've been typing other ones, but if you could, it may be nice to include a link to what is the public and digital public infrastructure paper that Beatrice, Mariana, and I have written, because I think it dives into that question in a lot more detail. So I think one thing about digital, like the piece I would just say around digital public infrastructure is our test here is there a public interest entity that is overseeing the operations of the infrastructure? Now, I want to be clear, that could mean that the infrastructure is built and operated by a set of government employees. It could be an open source solution that the government is choosing to implement itself. It could be an open source solution the government is hiring a contractor to implement, but it could also include hiring a proprietary vendor who is then going to deploy that infrastructure, but works under the auspices of the government. And we take no opinion about the goodness or badness of that. We're merely in this thing, we're merely trying to track that. One of the goals of the DPI map is for us to amass data so that others can do more research and assess, is that a good outcome or a bad outcome? We might be able to help you identify more places where, to help you categorize what are the countries that are doing this and what are the different approaches, so that then you could then go and ask those questions and either come to an academic response, or you might be an advocate and you have opinions about what is the right answer, and you can use our data to both help shape those arguments and try to influence public policy. So for me, the publicness really is about, it really comes down to not is the government operating, but is the service is the DPI working in the service of the public interest with some form of public interest oversight. And that is what our metrics really focus in on.
Great. I think we have time for maybe a few more questions. I'll bring two of them. They have different topics, but I think it's easier for you to answer them all at once. So Eric brought this question, which is, have you done any research or do you plan doing any research on funding for DPI? Example, where the funding for DPI projects come from. And there's another interesting question that I think it's always, this is a topic that always comes up, which is the access and use for data infrastructure or internet access. So Alison brought this question, which is, no measurements of foundational digital and data infrastructure or internet access and use. If not, can this be problematic for developing countries? So it's really different topics of really different questions, but I think it would be interesting to close thinking about those topics.
Christina, do you want to take a first cut?
I'm trying to find Alison in the question chat. Going to read out the question yet because I'm not sure if I understand. There's no measurement of foundational digital and data infrastructure, internet access and use are recorded. Yes, that's very relevant. We had a discussion on this, and the conclusion that we arrived at is that foundational ICT infrastructures can be treated as inputs to the DPI, which is definitely a confounding variable for whether or not DPI itself would be successful. But in our conception, it's still treated as an input. And very honestly, there's data out there on tracking all of this. We're not the first folks to map IT or ICT infrastructure, and we don't want to replicate information. So if at some point in the near future, there's a way to have the map also track inputs, this would be included, but we would rely very heavily on data already reported. We are more concerned in the states that comes after the input, which is identity, payments, and exchange.
I want to add two things to this. So one is, in my own view, I think sometimes people think that DPI means that every single individual in a location must have access to the internet in order to leverage DPI. And actually, well-constructed DPI does not require that. In fact, it should enable models of service delivery that don't require internet connectivity. And so, for example, like in places like Bangladesh, like in India and a few other places, like you do have these agent models that have emerged where people are using DPI to authenticate people and do transactions, even in places where there's no internet connectivity, because you can actually have agents go into the community with a device, run the transactions remotely, and then come back into kind of range of the internet, and then resolve all of the transactions. And that is the kind of opportunity for inclusion that I think DPI can create. And so if you try to say, oh well, it relies on internet connectivity to be successful for every single individual, I think you're actually closing off what the potentials are to overcome some of those limitations. That's not to say that I don't think we should be striving for a world of internet connectivity for everyone. I 100% think we should, but we're probably not going to get there immediately. And so what are the things that we can be doing to bridge that? And can DPI be a way in doing that? There was a second part of that question of just like, are we tracking the funding and financing of DPI? And at the moment, we're not, in part because that's just our resources are very finite. The team here is not large, and we're trying to cover the entire globe. And so every single additional question that we need to ask is like an explosion of work we have to do. And particularly on the financing piece, that's a particularly hard thing to figure out, because it's not like governments often carve out a separate budget and say, this is what we spend on DPI. It may require actually a significant amount of work to go and parse a budget and figure out how much money was spent on this. That's not a question that's going to be easily lying around. Many of the things we're currently doing are not easy questions that are lying around. And that's one of the reasons it works. So the addition of that is very, very real. I will say we would love to do more, but we will need resources to do more. And maybe, Julia, that will just take me to another question someone asked, which is like, what is the plan for the map? And I want to say, like, one plan we have right now is we just want to keep updating it. But our hope is to be thinking about kind of like an annual cycle to have kind of a definitive map. So I think this marks a definitive moment in time for us. We're like, wow, okay, we did like the whole world. This is great. We have data. We'd like to update that data kind of incrementally as people give us more information. But our intention is like, funder permitting every single year to be able to have like a definitive statement to say, okay, this is what the state of DPI is at this date. But of course, the situation is dynamic, so we'll be changing, reflect it as best we can, but have these marker points. And so that's very much our goal, is to be able to continue this cycle going forward, and ideally expand maybe some of the things we're creating and continue to refine the indicators that we have. And so, like, sorry to ramble a little bit, but one indicator we have right now is most DPIs we say, is it used by 2 separate institutions? I think there's a world where we should probably be changing that number to 3 or to 5. Like, true DPI is infrastructure that many people are using, and 2 is a pretty low number. Like, we set the bar very low here. And so maybe we want to think about raising that bar over time. So those are the types of works, the types of thinking we're thinking about. And if this work is valuable to you, it's really helpful for us to hear that, so that we can then tell our funders, here are the people that are using our work. So if you're using us in any way, we'd love to hear from you, because it helps us make the case that allows us to keep doing this work.
I'm mindful of time. We are already 2 minutes past. So I'm going to hand over to Christina, or back to you for you to close the session.
Christina, any final comments you'd like to make?
No, I think that's all. I really want to highlight something David said in the end. All the questions that were not answered involves more capacity on our team. So if you have ideas on what more the map should cover, that's incredibly helpful for us to hear, because it means that the map as a tool is of value to you. But if you have ideas on how we can integrate with other capacities that might exist within you or your organization, we'd love to talk more and see how existing data can be integrated with what we already have, and we can complement each other's efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for carving out time. These questions are really helpful to us. We're going to record the questions. They are indicators of what people would like us to be doing. Again, our resources are limited, but we'd like to. And recommendations of organizations we're reaching out to that I'm seeing some people are making as well are really, really appreciated. So just want to say thank you for carving out time. If you are using this data, please send us a note, just even a brief note saying, hey, we use it for this purpose. It's so helpful for us to hear. And frankly, it's really encouraging for the team to see, because then people realize their work has meaning. And so we're just grateful for everybody who's been participating, who's helped us, who's offered us feedback, and just engaged with us anyway. And just delighted that you all took out time of your day on a Friday to come and join us for this launch. And so thank you all so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.